G'day, brothers and sisters. This is the other Paul, and I'm here for another very special interview with a man who I only just found very recently by the good graces of the YouTube algorithm, Saint Militant. Mr. Militant, how are you going this kind of gloomy Australian morning?
It's actually kind of gloomy where I am too. I am great. Thank you for having me on. I'm very excited to talk. Very excited.
Too easy. Well, as for people watching, for the slightly vague, if you will, title and description, it's not so much vague as it is broad, because we wish to have just a general gloss of how the modern world functions, the paradigm in which the modern West has been governed since the end of the Second World War, at least. To kind of discuss that in brief, as well as some particular details that myself and Militant may want to get into, and then also how Christians should respond to that, and in fact why Christians should actually oppose the narrative as it is in a whole, and including particular points which we will get into the discussion of. So, as you can probably tell by the nature of the topic, by the thumbnail, what have you, it's going to be quite the spicy episode. And hey, people who know me, especially if you talk to me in real life or video chat or on Twitter or what have you, I'm fine with these spicy discussions. Everything that's not contained in the Holy Scriptures, anything that is not taught in Holy Scripture can't be bound to a man as an article of faith or as requisite for salvation, as Article 6 of the 39 Articles say. So it is in principle perfectly fine, free game. And in fact, it's an intellectual obligation for us to address such issues as this when they have such world-altering importance as these ones do. And just before we jump in, I am going to very quickly thank my legendary supporters. If you want to help me turn this into a proper full-on job, full-on income, with more frequent content, higher quality content, you can become a supporter at my locals. And as it stands, here are my legendary supporters here. Thank you, legends, very much for helping me keep this up and going. And with that said, so I got my notes up. Actually, I just pretty much from the email, I have that open. So, Mr. Militant, can you please introduce yourself and what you do and why, insofar as you're comfortable saying so without exposing yourself publicly?
Yes. So yeah, as you can tell, I do hide my identity because let me start once again. Let me start with my name, Saint Militant. I do the podcast A Time for War, which I based on Ecclesiastes 3:8. And the reason why I hide my identity is because I am by trade, essentially, a high school history, government, and economics teacher at a Christian school. And that's very important because, a lot of the stuff I do talk about on the podcast, as you just said, is pretty spicy. The point of the podcast is essentially to kind of point out to people who are your enemies and how to combat them, how to know them, and how Christians should be able to engage with them. Because as I've gotten older, the more and more I've engaged with people, the more I realize that, man, there definitely needs to be some distinctions here on who our enemies are and who our allies are, especially because times are changing. Because the whole theme of the podcast especially is for those who understand the times and their enemies. That's like kind of the way I always put it. So I do this kind of for fun, but I am trying to take it somewhere. But I also love my passion, which is Christian education. So it's kind of a little brief thing about me there. So.
Excellent stuff. We definitely have a lot of common ground there, because actually for a brief bit, I actually was studying secondary school teaching, as we call it here, grades 7 to 12, and I did a couple of teaching practical sessions during my study, or whatever, but it didn't end up panning out for reasons out of my control. But I actually, after the fact, thought, I think that's actually for the better, just because of all the red tape and controls and landmines basically you have to walk around in the in the teaching space in general, whereas I have a lot more freedom and a lot more influence in places like this and all that. So I think I work for the better. But nonetheless, I think we can. I think we'll have a lot to relate on the nature of the profession as well, and especially wanting to make sure the teaching is truthful and all that. Because I'd imagine in the United States, even in a Christian school, you'd have some fairly tight regulations on acceptable teaching areas and topics and what have you.
Yeah. So, essentially, especially being a history teacher, one thing I found just my first year of teaching is people are just really touchy on just so many different things. Even when you're not trying to be offensive, you know what I mean? And that's the thing that's even in Christian education that I have found, which I actually usually talk with another guy, Jason Modar, and he also works in Christian education. I wanted to do an episode with him, essentially describing how I've even seen in Christian education this kind of creeping in of liberalism, of just like wanting to soften everything. And it's so ironic that many people just like don't want teachers to tell the truth, especially in history. They want them to just do like the basic teaching. Don't push my kid, you know, in the sense that like intellectually, like pushing them on boundaries and beliefs. And like, because every time I actually do push my students, you always have those few, and especially their parents, who are liberal, and they send their kids to a Christian school, and they get really mad when you push them with like an actual Christian worldview. And so even at my school now, which I love, is that I've run into many problems that way, that even if I just gave like a very basic, even down the middle, doesn't matter how much I try to nuance the topic, they still like get really upset. And so even in Christian education, you do find that people want you to hold to certain boundaries.
Mm.
I've kind of taught my students to not do that. Like my first lesson, I kid you not, is I put a whole list of policies on the board, and you know, it like really good ones that Christians, a lot of them would support. And then what I did is then I drew a line. I said, all right, who would support these, like majority of these? And the kids raised their hand. I drew a line, and then I said, you're all, and then I wrote Nazis in big letters. And I said, you have to go into history. You can't go into it black and white all the time. You know what I mean? Because all the kids were like, oh my gosh, I'm a Nazi, you know? So
Literally Hortler. Yeah.
they talk about it all the time. You know, they make it as a joke. So because they think it's hilarious, because that really
yeah.
the tone for the year. And so even in Christian education, man, you still find those boundaries that they want you to hold by. I've been kind of pushing them a little bit at my school, and I found that it worked, but I did had to like butt heads with people over it. But yeah, man, sorry to keep going, but it's just I get really passionate about this stuff because, dude, you want the next generation to know the truth, right? That's a
Absolutely.
biblical demand, you know. So
absolutely, and you know, even if it turned out, that everything we're taught in the schools of the nature of the world since the Second World War, during and since the Second World War, even if everything we've been taught is actually 100% correct, it's about the principle of, well, this is a question of historical inquiry.
yeah,
And in the Christian perspective, everything's up for grabs. Everything is free to be critiqued outside of the apostolic deposit.
yep.
So to wall that off as like, if you dare touch this, you're touching a sacred cow of society. That is by definition setting up a new religion. There's no real way around that.
Yeah, one thing I also do just for the kids is one thing I never really, I know some teachers do this, is they never really tell their position. My favorite professors, especially in college, was they always told me where they were coming from, how they got there. And so what I'll do is I'll usually give both sides, and then I'll tell them, here's where I got. And so all the kids always knew throughout, especially this year, that they always knew I was like pretty far right on the spectrum. I never hid that. And then the kids that were on the left actually ended up being some of my favorite students, because we would go back and forth in class, and the kids loved it. You know what I mean? And I actually found it beneficial to everybody, including those kids who were more liberal or more on the left, because I pushed them. You know what I mean? They didn't just like stay in their position. They saw moments of being like, oh wow, actually that does make a lot of sense what you're saying. You know what I mean? I'm one of those teachers where I will tell them where I'm at and where I've changed my mind and things like that. Some people don't do that. I found that it's beneficial and that it helps. So that's kind of what I've been doing.
No, I completely sympathize with that, because it actually fosters greater intellectual integrity and honesty when you are open about your position, rather than keeping it hidden and saying, oh, well, I'm not going to let my position influence things, when actually, just with the nature of epistemology, shout out to my presuppositionalist friends out there, everything runs, there's no neutrality. Everything runs on particular presuppositions. And so a teacher who actually doesn't give their position is actually more dangerous in that way, precisely because they're actually not telegraphing to their students where they're coming from. And so the students, naive as they are, think that the teacher's just kind of being a bit neutral about it. And that, oh, look, the truth happens to go this way, when it's actually, it may be the truth, or it might just be an artifact of the teacher's presuppositions. So that's something I actually strive to do as well in all my conversations. I'm completely open with my position, and try to seek to persuade people to my way, but ultimately by being honest. Even with really spicy issues, which, like, look, you mentioned it, you if I was to say my position in a public space on certain issues, I'd absolutely be cancelled. Media would be all around me, insofar as I'm relevant and all that stuff.
Yeah.
But ultimately, if people ask me about anything, I'll give them the straight up about my position. And I find that even people who are really uncomfortable in my position or even shocked by it, they end up showing more respect, precisely because I'm open and I'm cordial and civil about it.
That's the success I found. Same exact thing. Like, you nailed it. Yeah, that's like pretty much what I found too. So
excellent. Yep. Well, with that said, I want to narrow down first on the video which I found you. So, totally kid you not, it was literally by the grace of the YouTube algorithm that I never heard of you a lick before. I mean, you're a very small channel after all, and yet just randomly in the algorithm, I one day saw this random video just pop on the front of my page, a response to Douglas Wilson on anti-Semitism, or whatever the exact title was. I'll pull it up right now just to actually make sure, because I do actually want to promote both your channel and also this video in particular.
Yeah.
So I randomly saw this video just pop up on the timeline, just out of nowhere, completely out of nowhere. Here it is: a disagreement with Doug Wilson on anti-Semitism. So again, people, I'm going to say it again towards the end, but do subscribe to A Time for War. This video and his other videos on other issues are fantastic. Really great content creator. He deserves your love, deserves your subscriptions. But I found this one, and I found it, I believe, during my walk. As I was doing it, I was doing a walk in my local area, and I was thinking, when I looked at it, I thought, okay, this video is either going to go one of two ways. It's either going to be really based or really cringe. either your disagreement is going to be that, it's either going to be that, oh, Wilson, you don't go far enough against these evil anti-Semites like Isker and blah, blah, blah. Or you're going to be, actually, Wilson, you're way too committed to the whole anti-Semitism, pro-Israel thing. So I was kind of worried at first. I was debating whether I wanted to watch it, but I thought, you know what, stuff it. Let's give it a listen. Let's see what he's about. I start listening, and eventually towards the beginning, you basically note the nature of your disagreement as, well, his framing of anti-Semitism and his dismissal of people bringing up the Bolsheviks, and how the group, just to use coded language, were largely who made up and pushed the Bolshevik Revolution. And then, so as we were listening, I was like, okay, this is gonna be a good one. So I just listened to it the whole way through the walk, and I was like, wow, this is really good. This guy deserves some promotion. So listening to that, what gave you the idea to respond to this video? Like, how did that idea come about to respond to Pastor Douglas Wilson on this issue?
Yeah, well, because if you go to my channel, usually what I'm focusing on is the big theme I was kind of doing before Douglas Wilson, or just even this topic of anti-Semitism, is I've been talking about, like, what the heck is an evangelical, and I've been going over guys like Phil Vischer and all of this, and because, like, they're saying the same thing, and every time they say it's an evangelical, somehow it leads to liberalism. So that's kind of what I was hammering on for like a long time, and then I just got really busy, to be honest. And then this topic, I just kind of noticed started to creep into the conversations to a lot of different podcasts I was listening to. And the first time I ever noticed it was when Doug and Andrew kind of went back and forth. And I was like genuinely surprised why Doug responded the way he did. I was like kind of blown away. I was like surprised that Andrew I kind of put it like this in the video. I said he kind of put him in the dirt. Like, he did win that discussion, I thought. And
just like rhetorical dominance by the looks of it. I mean,
yeah,
it was cordial.
It was,
but it was definitely like an interrogation type sitting.
Yeah,
literally surrounded by people who disagree with him.
Right. And I noticed, even just talking to younger guys, even just like including my brother-in-law, who's like I'm really close with, and he started talking about the Jews a lot and all this, and I just was like, I was like, okay, especially younger guys. I noticed this conversation was coming up, and I just went, okay, I love the older guys, but it just doesn't seem like they're nailing this right now. Like even like James White, who I call Doug Wilson and James White, I call grandpa. You know what I mean? They're like they're my theological grandpas. Like I love them. And so I saw Doug Wilson go on Foolproof Theology with Chase Davis, and once again, he kept using the term envy. And I saw him do this in the other video, and I remember when I originally heard it, I said that just doesn't make sense. That just doesn't add up. That answer I just don't think is good enough. Like you cannot go to these younger guys and say you're saying these things because of envy. You're jealous of these people. And so I'm kind of a younger guy. I'm 32. I'm getting up there, but I'm still kind of considered on the younger side. And like I just was like, and you know what? A younger person, like a guy who knows the situation, who actually is talking to young guys who are like in high school in their early 20s, seeing them face to face, who knows that they're not anti-Semitic. They're just pointing things out and they're just genuinely questioning. And that kind of drove me to make this episode with all the love in my heart, because it does I just don't think what Doug Wilson is doing when he says things like that is that's just going to anger a lot more younger guys. And I know he's a little frustrated because I heard him on that Room for Nuance podcast, and he said like, oh yeah, these guys are telling me to kind of step aside, thank you for all you've done, but step aside on this topic. But the thing is like he's just not answering it well. And so that drove me to make this episode. But not only that, I wanted to actually show the history behind the 20th century, especially with the Germans and the Jewish people. Because one thing I started to find was exactly probably what we're going to go into, is just I got a different answer. I actually started reading Hitler and I started to understand what he was saying. He uses terms a certain way and things like that. And I just want people who might not agree with me to at least be able to have the ability, but specifically Christians, to have the ability to look in the past and be able to answer questions and be able to read history well and understand it and not spurg out. And that's why the whole Douglas Wilson thing was kind of annoying me, because he keeps claiming, if you point these things out, like the Bolshevik Revolution and what they did in the 20th century, that's kind of leaning towards the anti-Semitic side. Yeah. And I just kept saying, like, that's just not good enough. Like, that's going to anger, because there's so many similarities to today, which we can get into. And that's what scared me. And so I kind of made it also out of fear for the younger guys, because if some actual Christians don't start speaking into this, some legitimate National Socialists who are not Christian will do that. You know what I mean? Guys on the right who we might agree with on certain things, but aren't Christian and are legitimately hate these people and want to do it again. And so,
this summarizes it right here. It's Bulverism, just straight up. You're just envious, bro.
Yeah, I don't know. And that's why I made it, because I was just like, Doug, please. and like that whole 50 minutes was to just set it up, because I gave that lesson almost point by point to my students, and I found it was extremely beneficial. And so I wanted to give that to people, especially Christians in general. So that's why I put it out, was to help, because I love the older guys, but man, I just think on this topic, they're just angering and frustrating a lot of younger guys like myself. You know what I mean?
That is beautifully right in line with my way of thinking too. I mean, once again, I once was going to go into high school teaching. I had a little bit of experience with that. Both very historically minded guys want to see open debate on any number of issues outside of matters of the faith for Christians, without fear of cancellation. But also even just how you articulated it as a, gosh, I can't believe I just lost my train of thought. It was actually a really, really good point. Something about what you were just, Gosh, it was a really flipping good point. I can't.
No,
can't
I'm
believe
not
this
sure. I'm like, huh?
I just lost it instantly. So, like, briefly summarize what you said for the past 5 minutes, just like super quick.
I made the video because I was scared that younger guys could get radicalized. I don't know.
That's what. That's actually another really close point of comparison we have. The reason why one major reason why I'm into these issues as well is that I do see genuine good points on much of the dissident right talking points out there on them, but also even more so, just like you said, I get into it precisely so that we don't give the monopoly on this issue to the more radicalized ones, both those who falsely claim the name of Christ, but also the outright pagan ones as well. Because in the end, we're Christians. We are Christians. We believe it's the true faith, and if these are legitimate issues that young men in particular need answers for, and if our clergy very consistently, and by our clergy I can't just mean like what's common out there, I do know a number of clergy by God's grace who don't destroy their parishioners and others for entertaining these issues or whatever, even if they disagree with them, and I thank them so much. And one in particular I'm thinking of, you know who I'm talking about. I won't name him in case people try to drag him through the mud. But in either way, yeah, it is precisely that is one of my major motivators as well, precisely because there are more genuinely radical ones out there. They're not radical because, oh, well, it's a predefined post-war concept of radical, but radical in the genuine sense of non-Christian, in that either they're explicitly pagan or explicitly atheist, or they claim to be Christian, but their actions and beliefs are most manifestly not that. And so we have a really, really big overlap with that, which is absolutely fantastic. I'm really glad I picked this out for an interview. And sorry. Yeah. Sorry, no, go.
And just to add too, because just being honest is when and that's why a huge reason why I made the video was because of the fear thing with younger guys, because I myself, while I started to read these sources and started to know this for the first time, I got like angry, and it's very hard because you feel lied to. Like you feel like everything that you're kind of experiencing, you're just like, wow, this is just like all kind of a lie. And I know even for myself, it was even really hard to not get pulled into that to a point, like because you do get angry and you start to see what was stolen from you, and you start to see that everything you were told growing up was just not true. And I could see why guys today, when they start to figure this out, they want to just automatically run to the far, like super far right to a point, and just go full blown like as hardcore and just start doing the Nazi salute and screaming Il Duce. You know what I mean? And
exactly.
I understood that pull because and once again, it's when I started reading these guys, I started to go like, oh wow, I actually do agree with some of the, not some, but sometimes a good large amount of what they're saying once I actually understood what they were saying. And it's very difficult to not get sucked into that. And I think this is why you see certain young guys who figure this out. They just, all they want to do is just scream about the Jays. You know what I mean? Yeah. That's all they want to do. And that's not what I'm trying to do. I'm actually just trying to teach people you can know these things and you don't have to be radicalized, and you can openly talk about what these people do and did. You can do that. That's okay. You don't have to be crazy. You can still be a Christian and believe these things. It's okay. So
absolutely true.
That's a huge reason why I made the video, especially for Christians. Like every single Christian that I've talked to, like even including family members, and told them like, what'd you think? They were like, I just didn't know, and it really does. I've been finding it really helps people. It's been really helpful. So
yeah, absolutely. And that's what I think is so fitting about you basing your channel name on a portion of that beautiful Ecclesiastes chapter 3 verse 8, which is something that every Christian should have burned in their mind, that there is a season and a time for everything. And so hypothetically, if people want to engage in questions about the Jews, about the people, about what they've done in the past or whatever, how Christians and even just non-Jews in general should interact with them and what have you. All those questions can and should be entertained, even if only for the reason that, publicly speaking, you're not allowed to for the most part, except in particular non-public circles. And those are definitely questions I'm reckoning with myself. Heck, I'm about to have a whole video about that at the end of the month. But but ultimately, the Christian way is to have those questions answered and then apply Ecclesiastes 3:8. There's a time for everything. There's a time and a place for everything. So in other words, just exactly as you said, you entertain those questions, you get genuine answers to them, you take them seriously, but then it doesn't turn into just screaming about the Jews. Oh, the Jews did this, the Jews did that, the Jews killed my puppy last week, or what have you. And just not being absolutely obsessed with it. Not as a call to not take it seriously, but the opposite. You do take it seriously, but you keep it in its proper place. So that's quite critical. I'm glad you mentioned that. And so along that line as well, taking I guess the telescope a bit further back from just your video, what got you into what pushed you in general to study with greater depth? I guess you kind of given some answers to it, but I guess in terms of more precise, concrete details, what pushed you to do deeper study of like the last century plus of Western history, and how did it change the way you think about things?
The way I always tell people is I started going into this and I came out a very different person. That's usually like, because I'll just be honest, like I like everybody else, like I was a hardcore libertarian, you know what I mean? Like you know what I mean? Like I can't, I was like totally a part of the liberal order, right? And but just going back, like just even calling back to my dad always taught me to question everything. Like you don't just take everything at face value. And sometimes it's really good and sometimes it was really bad, right? Like I would sometimes take that and question my parents, right? Not good. But one thing that my dad always taught me was, especially with these things and what people claim to be true, is you always question this stuff. You always question what the government tells you. You always question even what doctors will say to you sometimes. Like you just question. You don't just take it at face value. Just it's okay to ask questions. And so I've always lived by that. And especially when I started to really take my faith seriously, and I was going to like an evangelical church, which was good for the time, but I started to dive into like theology first, which I can see the pattern why the Lord is taking me this direction. And I started in like theology and like church history a little bit, and I started to go to my pastors and I started to ask them like a butt ton of questions, like just a crazy amount, like how come you've never taught us like what the Trinity is? Like, dude, I didn't really understand how to explain the Trinity until I was like 26.
Oof,
right? Like I just didn't know how to do that. I just was never taught it, right? So I had no idea. All I knew was like, don't drink, don't have sex, and Jesus was your savior. That's kind of like all I understood. You know what I mean? Hence why I rejected it for a while. And then so it kind of started theologically. It took me to things like theonomy, places like that, and I started going deeper and deeper and deeper. And I got like, and this led me to start questioning even like evangelical leaders, like, you know, Tim Keller, I talk about a lot because I think he's like the centerpiece of all of this, like why we have a lot of problems in evangelicalism in the modern day. And like, I just started questioning all these pastors, started questioning evangelicalism and the history of it. And like, I don't know, was Billy Graham actually good for the church here? Like, what is this, you know? And which is controversial to say, but like, I just genuinely question these things. And I started going down that route, and I got a lot of like anger, pushback, especially in church history. I started asking my pastors, like, why aren't we taught this? They like didn't really have an answer. Just pretty much told me stop kind of questioning this and stop talking about Tim Keller, you know. And what it eventually led me down is I started, once I kind of got there, I had the theological basis for everything. I started moving kind of a little more right wing, little theonomic. Then I started running into like the political realm again, like a political theology. And then that naturally connected to history. And so I wanted to specifically understand, like, why are people who are on the left able to say essentially whatever the heck they want and be as liberal as they want, as I found in my old evangelical church. But if I said like things like, hey, I actually understand why God has the death penalty for adultery. Like I can see the logic behind it and things like that. And no, you don't have to agree with it, but I would just make the argument a lot of the time. And I understand like how it was like to put fear into people. And I would quote the law and like all this stuff. And people would literally lose their minds, dude, like shouting, like freak out on me. You're an extremist. You know what I mean? Like one of the pastors called me that. And
Dear.
I was devastated. I was frustrated and I was devastated. And I just was like, am I wrong? You know? And so this led me to start then going into the political history route. And I ended up finding very quickly that, yeah, the reason why right-wing people are not allowed to actually be right-wing is because it essentially was made illegal after World War II. You are not allowed to do that. And the reason why is because technically the liberalism as we know it technically defeated fascism or right-wing thought, you could say, in both Europe and the United States. And if you know anything about liberalism, it's heavily connected to communism. It's like they work together, and that's what I kept finding. And so, because I could not figure out why for the longest time, why liberals would so much cushion inside the church I was going to, like people being like, oh, you know, homosexuality's fine, and they get a slap on the wrist, and then I would be like, I think homosexuality should be outlawed and there should be penalties, and people would be like, oh my gosh, you know, like it was crazy. And so I just eventually found out, well, that's because the right wing was destroyed essentially after World War II. You can't do that.
And can you quickly check the private chat as well?
Yeah. What's that?
Can you quickly check the private chat as well?
Yes, I'm looking at it. I'm sorry. Oh yes, sorry. Yeah, sorry, I got a little confused.
Only if you want to, and insofar as
no, and to be honest, yes, there of course is influences, right? In one of them, as kind of going into history, did start. You and me talked about before the show was like Stone Choir, right? Which, by the way, I don't even really agree with everything they say in every podcast. Sometimes I'm kind of like, all right, chill.
Nah, me neither.
You know what I mean? I'm like, all right, chill, dog. Like, you're good. But Stone Choir's episode, The Big Lie, was probably a good starting point.
Right.
Actually, you know, Contra Mundum was one. They started to make me feel like, oh, yeah, on younger guys, you can be right wing. Another one was like Peter Quinones. Because what was happening was those guys were saying things that I was thinking. And that made me more comfortable to be like, oh, no, this isn't crazy. This is very legitimate.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I would say the big three for me on like at least right wing thought has definitely been like, or at least the two has definitely been Peter Quinones's channel. And then definitely like Contra Mundum. That's probably the two. And that's kind of how I knew about you at first.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that's kind of like how it started. But it just came down to a lot of reading, hearing books being recommended and going into that. So, yeah, that's kind of how I started going into that. And I go down all these crazy routes anyway, to be honest with you. Like, I'm always open to anything. Like, I remember just in the summer, I was bored and I looked into like Great Tartaria. It's freaking ridiculous, but it's fun. You know, it's like, you know, I'm always into that kind of stuff. Like any type of narrative in the 20th century, I automatically question it. Gulf of Tonkin, you want to get spicy, 9/11, like anything like that. Like I definitely, almost any narrative I'm now given in the 20th century, I instantly question it. You know what I mean?
Yep. And what's really funny with that is I'm pretty much seeing now it's pretty much a gold rush on just all major 20th and early 21st century events that was pretty much just commonly believed by everyone in a certain way, even by many people on the dissident right. And I've thought for a while now, I think everyone's going to be revisiting those ones. And I specifically thought a few months ago, I think, I'm thinking about what we're all told about the Nixon Watergate scandal or whatever. And it's like, I hadn't read anything into that at nothing
Yeah, I
whatsoever.
know.
I just knew of the story as it's always told. I
Yeah.
wasn't even aware I
Yep.
wasn't even aware that if there was any dissident narrative whatsoever on the Nixon Watergate scandal. But I thought nonetheless a few months ago, I wonder if we were lied about that as well. Sure enough, I see
Yeah, I know.
CJ Engel
Yep,
from
I knew you were gonna
Contramundum
bring
on
it up.
the Chronicles podcast
Yep.
interview a guy who's involved in legal battles to basically show that we were lied to about the Nixon, or at least you Americans were lied to about the whole Nixon Watergate scandal as well. That actually it was basically a big political political coup in a way. So I was like, wow, color me surprised with that as
Yeah.
well. And
Yeah.
I have to say as well. I have to agree as well. The Contramundum guys found them, and it's just like, mate, you guys are speaking my language. I think
Yeah.
it was a bit earlier when I first saw Stone Choir as well, and I have to agree as well. Obviously, there's some certain takes of theirs that are more extreme. That I'm like, okay, guys, calm down. Like for example, they're Lutherans. They believe the reprobate taking the Lord's
Right.
Supper.
Right.
That's the extreme part. No. But unironically, I listened to a bunch of their stuff over time. And I obviously first found it because I saw just blowing up on my Twitter feed, like, oh, this Corey Marler guy, neo-Nazi, what have you, going to be excommunicated and all that. And then I just thought, well, for the longest time then, I'd always, even as like a teen, I'd kind of just casually, when I was told stuff in the mainstream, I just casually like, oh, okay, sure. But I didn't take it super seriously.
Yeah.
I'd hold to it as a religion like it's promoted today. And so when I first saw the controversy with Marler and what have you, I was just like, okay, what's going on here? I decided to look at it a bit. I didn't just assume that everything everyone was saying about him was right. And then that's when I found, okay, Stone Choir, started listening to a lot of their stuff. And I'm thinking, wow, okay, these guys are actually saying out loud a lot of things which I've actually believed quite a bit. Not in every detail, of course. And I also don't just listen to what they say. Even they themselves say, I don't just listen to what they say, including their more spicy takes, and just immediately assume, oh, they must be right about this. Look how smart and well sourced they are. I give them good deference, granted, but in the end, even just with those things that I already thought about and already studied, I see them echoing the same things, and I'm like, wow, these guys are actually they say a lot of really good stuff. Whatever you think about whatever other people may think of certain other takes of them, even if people think they're absolutely abhorrent. Which if for people wanting to explore that, just to make it clear, if you want to, for anyone else watching who's more mainstream, shall we say, if you want to really attack what the Stone Choir guys say about about the Third Reich, about Adolf Hitler and what have you, and if you're going to condemn people for like speaking positively in any way about them and saying, I listen to them, I like their content, at least generally speaking, I really do hope you do the same for every single person who enjoys ancient philosophers, because the ancient philosophers had some shocking opinions as well.
Yeah.
Really shocking opinions. You need to be consistent with that. And numerous other writers as well from the ancient and Middle Ages and what have you. So obviously, if I say I like Stone Choir, that doesn't mean, okay, I agree with every single one of their points. I'm also not giving this as like a, but I repudiate what they say about this and this and that. Even the most spicy takes about Nazi Germany and Adolf Hitler, in the end, those are post-revelatory points of historical fact. It's fine for people to discuss those and question narratives and what have you. So this isn't me saying, oh, but I repudiate them on this as well. I'm not gonna play that game, because that is what it is. It's a game when people demand that you condemn them or other like-minded people for certain views. But anyway, a little bit of a tangent. So I just wanted to say that, similar paths as well in terms of things you listen to, influences and what have you.
Yeah.
But in any event, and it's also my philosophy, even though I'm a public face and what have you, my philosophy is just to be completely open about everything I like and believe. So if I'm going to get cancelled or denied certain opportunities, it happens straight away rather than getting neck deep in something and then getting cancelled later. But in any event, did you have more to say about your journey in these areas of study, or was that it? Or
well, the thing I would say, just for like kind of younger guys listening to this who are kind of going down this road, it's not like I started figuring these things out and I just like jumped down the slide and was like, wee, and just jumped into the pool. I like legit, when I heard these things at first, I was like, am I crazy? Like, is this true? This can't be true. And like and that's the thing. It always went back to like the church I was going to. Like I legitimately felt nuts. And I remember even just calling my wife last year on the phone and just being like I think I'm far right. you know, like, like I think I'm a far right person, you know, and like, you know, especially with the Christian nationalist stuff, I was like, because I was kind of getting there even before the term really like kicked around. Like I was asking questions of just like, especially like the theonomy stuff. I started going like, do you actually have religious freedom? Do you? You know, and I started asking these questions to even my students and things like that. And I didn't instantly go down this route, and especially Stone Choir's episode, The Big Lie, about a certain event that happened with a certain people group, right? And they question a lot of stuff of that narrative.
Yep.
And it's really compelling. And it's really, really difficult to refute it. And every source that they gave, I did not just sit there and go, it's true. Like I went there and I read the material and I sat there and I went, holy crap, this is real. Especially with the Jewish writers from the 20th century. Like that stunned me.
Those quotes you read were shocking. I want to chase them up myself and anything else, but those are shocking.
I know. And I grew up in a home, man, where my dad always put into me, like, you know, we love the Israeli people. We love the Jewish people. I even celebrated Passover with like a Jewish friend. Like my dad took me to a Passover. Like we had like the Jewish calendar in my computer room growing up. Like it was in my home, right? And so I just rejected a lot of that stuff. And then I went back to it again and I just started looking into the Third Reich and all of that stuff. And I just really started digging deep. And I found out there's a bunch of books that are written just not by crazy people like Patrick Buchanan writing Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War, and just a totally different perspective. And I was shocked. It was hard for me to get through that. I was really, because dude, I was a product of the 20th century. You know, I was in the public school learning all this stuff, and it's just what I knew. One of my favorite movies is Inglourious Bastards. I love that movie. And that's just what I thought about the Nazis, you know? Yeah. And I always hated communism, which is funny, right? I always hated it. Even as a kid, I read 1984 when I was 15. I was like, communism sucks. And I hated it ever since then. But I never really thought about the fascists until I was older. And then I started actually reading them. And I was like, oh, wow. Okay. So they're just responding. And that a certain people group was connected to communism. You know, that was the most shocking part. So, yeah, and so just to go back real quick, just to end it is, younger guys, like, don't just know the sources. Like, just, you got to read this stuff because you can't just go into it and just accept everything, you know? Because even the documentary Stone Choir mentions, there's some really good info in there, but they do a lot of sleight of hand in there too. And luckily, you know, I'm a little older, a little wiser that I can look through it. But you know what I mean? You know what I'm talking about?
Absolutely true.
So you got to be really careful. And I would have not done that presentation on YouTube if I didn't think that was true. You know what I mean? I would have never done that. But
absolutely
I did my homework, you know, I had to.
Yeah, and that was what we discussed a little bit earlier, the danger of people in our position, especially younger guys, where they're first finding these things and they have the risk of just swinging the pendulum way too hard to the point where they're now just uncritically accepting whatever their favorite dissident podcasters or what have you tell them, which again, even those podcasters themselves, like Stone Choir and others, they will explicitly tell you, don't just listen to us, chase these things up yourself, become personally acquainted. I say that all the time on my own channel as well, because it's precisely because we believe what we are saying is demonstrably true, and that if you are an honest, well-reasoned person and you really seek out the sources as they are, then you will come to the same conclusion. That's how confident I am. That's how confident they are, and what have you. And that's what's absolutely necessary to do. And before we move on to some more specifics on this narrative, again, I want to read Article 6 of the 39 Articles of Religion, which basically summarizes the attitude we must have towards these kinds of spicy discussions, where it says, Holy Scripture containeth all things necessary to salvation, so that whatsoever is not read therein, nor may be proved thereby, is not to be required of any man, that it should be believed as an article of faith, or be thought requisite or necessary to salvation. So, in other words, post-revelatory history, free game. Free game. People are free to, insofar as they're being honest, because if you're being dishonest with things, if you know evidence points one way, and yet you're knowingly going the other way, you're basically lying, you're sinning against your conscience, you're sinning against your God-given intellect. That's sinful. You will go to hell if you don't repent of that. But otherwise, insofar as you're being honest, if you honestly come to certain conclusions in history, wheresoever they go, outside of revelatory history, that does not affect your relationship with God at all, no matter the question. Yes, even if that leads to different opinions, which obviously Saint Militant, as you said, you're not exactly the Hurl Hortler type guy, if people know what I mean. But obviously, again, even if people were to come to that thought through honest research, whether it was complete or not, perhaps it was even flawed, but if you honestly came to that belief, that's not going to affect your relationship as a Christian in itself. It can't, because again, post-revelatory events of history are not contained in Scripture. They are not to be bound upon people as articles of faith. So that's the ultimate framing that must be shouted from the rooftops to people when these issues come to the front.
Yeah.
And before we move on to more specifics on this matter, I want to remind people to post questions for the Q&A, which we will have at the end of this. And of course, super chats and local supporters will get priority. And particularly for local supporters, go to the locals page itself where I made a post with the link to this stream. Comment your questions if you're a local supporter under that post, so that I can clearly differentiate it and know that it's you, and differentiate it from other people's comments, so that I can prioritize you guys more easily. Now, with that said, with general thoughts, general prolegomena out of the way, one other question I have, which I think I completely lost for some reason. It should be here. There we go. So, how would you define it? Probably a tough one, but hopefully you thought about it since I gave the email.
I had to think about this.
Yeah. How would you define, just encapsulate the modern post-war narrative in a summary? How would you summarize it?
Yeah, the more I thought about it, the way I would put it like this is the United States and the West defeated pretty much the evil fascists, the evil right wing.
Good guys defeated bad guys.
Good guys versus the bad guys. And yes, we had to ally with ourselves with the Soviet Union, but Hitler had world domination in his mind, and we'd all be speaking German if not for these three powers, Britain, United States, and the Soviet Union, to defeat the Axis powers. And we would all be living in darkness and totalitarianism if we had not defeated them. And then essentially now the government's pretty much run after, will use that as anytime somebody goes against the West, they pretty much call him Hitler and use that as an excuse to dominate them. That's their narrative. It's their defining moment. And it that's kind of just like how I always boil it down. Is it really is just as simple as we were the good guys and they were the bad guys, and it's just that's it. And then sadly we had to fight the communists after that. It's kind of like how we put it. And then we were the good guys again, that's just kind of how this goes. Is we're not totalitarian, they are, and that's just kind of how it always sums it up, and how our government operates today. I mean, I always say this in my class. I always go, they call Putin Hitler, they call Saddam Hussein Hitler, they call everybody Hitler. It's just, that's just what they do. That is the post-war narrative. It is literally good guys versus bad guys. No nuance, no nothing. I don't use that term, by the way, nuance, in the lame way, but like genuine, like there's no gray, nothing. History's not complicated. Hitler was bad, so that's usually kind of how I put it. I know that was probably kind of a ham-fisted way to do it, but it really just comes down to that just basic principle.
Yeah, I have to agree. I think how I would include with that's a really good summary there. I think another dimension I'd include in that as well is that since the Second World War, European peoples are no longer allowed to have a self-assertion of their own identity, because otherwise that will lead to another evil Satan Hitler and what have you. Whereas non-European groups, and one in particular, are more than allowed to have their own assertion of identity, of their own interests. And that one group in particular, which was absolutely genocided throughout the Second World War, it was purely out of a pure malice for that group, which had, let's just be straight up, the Jews. Okay, we've already said it. There's no point writing it. But it was whatever happened to them in that war. Well, what is claimed to have happened absolutely happened, and if you question it, we will destroy your livelihood. But also, since that happened, that group, it happened to them. The Jews, they were genocided. There was absolutely no context leading up to that whatsoever, apart from just Hitler hated Jews. He read Martin Luther's On the Jews and Their Lies. And that just made, it was just a completely irrational, completely out of thin air hatred of Jews with no cause, no context behind it whatsoever. It was pure malice, pure unadulterated malice for absolutely no reason. None whatsoever.
That was a good decision, by the way. That is also the vital piece to all of that. That's nailed it.
Oh yeah, and your video talks about that, which
it does.
Which again, people can come to that conclusion. They can either come to the conclusion, whether it's a conclusion of, oh my word, the Jews are behind absolutely everything as a people group. Oh no, hail the Führer and all that jazz. Which, just as a historical thing, I hope people don't go that degree of a LARP. But otherwise, even if as a Christian, granting that big event did happen, as a Christian, you'd say, okay, that's bad, that's evil, but you can still nonetheless say, after doing historical research, but it didn't come from nowhere. Okay.
Right. And that's what my video is.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But in any event, so what do you think? Let's target just a small number, because obviously this would be, if we were to tackle them all, it would be a multi-part giga series. And even then, even with the points that we do cover, we have to be kind of brief. What particular points of the narrative do you think are most demonstrably shown false?
Yeah, I'm going to start it here, because this was the moment that I really started to question the kind of the Nazi Jewish World War II narrative, was the book burnings. The whole Nazi book burning thing. And that's what Candace Owens got in trouble for. And I did an episode before the one that I did, the one that we're talking about with Jason Modar, where we talked about Andrew Klavan talking about the Nazi book burnings, and it was just such a dumb take. And I just remember in the summer, I heard somebody go, yeah, and Hitler, it was just a brief comment, right? Just someone in a podcast was like, yeah, and not all the books that the Nazis were burning were bad. And I just remember I kind of stopped and I went, I don't think I've ever looked into that. And so I just looked into it, and I just started looking at the list, and then actually looking at the material and going on archive.org and starting reading it. And I very quickly found that almost everything they burned was far left trash or sexual degenerate trash. And, some people go oh, but they even burned Helen Keller's book, as if Helen Keller wrote those books. And then and I realized, well, Helen Keller was a communist. She wrote communist material. And even going all the way down to Albert Einstein. Why would they burn Albert Einstein's books? Well, Andrew Klavan says, well, it's because of Jewish math. That's why the Nazis just, they said it was Jewish math. Well, no, that's not what they said. They never said.
I saw that in Oppenheimer. Was that true, or was that also made up when they said, oh, the Germans, they wouldn't fund Heisenberg because quantum mechanics was just Jewish science? Was that a thing or what?
That is not true. That's not true. No, these are remember, don't forget, NASA is literally all Germans. The Nazis were pretty much NASA. And so this is why I always point out, you think the guys who are the top scientists I mean, these scientists in NASA were doing things like putting I don't know if you knew this, but they actually had like night vision on MP44s. Like they were using night vision on guns in like the end of the war. Like these are the top guys in science. I don't think that they're kicking Jewish people out because of Jewish math, apparently. I've never seen that quote. I've never heard that before. I don't know where they got that. The reason why Albert Einstein got kicked out of Germany was because he was an internationalist. He was a communist. And he called for a one world government with international courts and called for the end of Germany, essentially. And that's what you find with a lot of these Jewish intellectuals. They all call for the end of Germany. They want them destroyed. They want them punished, and they all pretty much say it like out loud. Like there's a book that says Germany must perish. And it was like written in 1942. And it talked about sterilizing the Germans and that was what was going on in the 20s and then going on in the 30s, and like the first one that I really realized was the book burnings. And once again, we always think of like Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, where they have this giant book burning pile and the Nazis are marching around it going, woo! And, you got Elsa Schneider crying. Hitler's at the top with Himmler, like, looking on it approvingly. But it really wasn't that. It was young men who were frustrated and angry and listening to what Hitler was saying, which he wasn't wrong on what he was saying. And they did it on their own. They took these books and they threw them into piles and burned them themselves, like guys who were in their 20s. It was their own doing. And when I figured that out, that was when the ball started rolling. I was like, uh-oh.
What do you know the date of when those burnings started?
Oh, geez. That was like I think that was like mid-20s. I think that was like mid-20s. Right. And then and don't get me wrong, I do think the Nazi higher ups did eventually kind of get involved, but once again, it wasn't like commissioned by them. A lot of the times they were spontaneous, like totally by themselves. It was just young guys doing it.
So we should put I wish I could put a poll in the chat right now. Was that the first White Boy Summer?
It might have been.
Sorry, I had to.
No, it's great.
I had to. I mean, look, I'm very comfortable saying that again, given the nature of what books were being burned. Like that was some
and they weren't like normal lefty books. Stuff. Yeah, like it was like the most insane trash you could think of. You know what I mean? Like a lot of the stuff you see today, you know what I mean? Like in videos and things like that, or just material, like you can even find in Barnes and Noble. Like that's what they were burning like 100 years ago. That's exactly what they were burning. They wanted it gone. They didn't want it anymore. And sadly, a majority of those books were written by Jews. And there's just no refuting that. Andrew Klavan was saying like, oh, they're burning like Ernest Hemingway or something like that, or Jack London. And then you look up those guys, all socialists. And you're just like, dude, what? Like, oh my gosh, I don't know. And it just like drives me up the wall now when I see I'm a little nicer, of course, to regular people, because most people don't know this. It's these kind of top guys that I get really frustrated with. I have a very different tone with those two groups, but yeah, man, just stuff like that. That was one key point, I would say, with the 20th century narrative. What was another thing that was attached to that, not to go too long, is sure. I always heard that the Nazis burned the Bible. That was another big one. It was even in the show The Waltons, I'm pretty sure. There was like a scene where they were burning books and they went to go throw the Bible in there. And that wasn't true. That wasn't true at all. They didn't do that. And just stuff like that. And like that's kind of, that was one narrative. When I figured that one out, that's when the ball really got rolling. And I was like, oh, wait a second. I think when Hitler says Jews, he means communists. He means Bolsheviks. You know what I mean? So, that's one. Do you want me to keep going, or do you want
to? That's probably like arguably the biggest one, most spicy one, of course, and yet in some ways one of the most important ones.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, keep going. What's your next big point in the narrative that you find false?
The next one was that the Russian Revolution was just the Russian Revolution. That just like what Alexander Solzhenitsyn said, who wrote that book 200 Years Together, which was literally a whole book about the Russians and the Jews living together. And they do separate themselves, by the way. Like him saying that, no, the Bolshevik Revolution was a Jewish revolution. That's pretty much what it was. And it was a communist Jewish revolution. And once again, once you understand that fact and you understand that the top of not only the communist leaders, who were 4 out of the 7 were Jewish, but that like a majority of like the commissars were, the majority of the like just the revolutionaries in general causing these problems were ethnically Jewish. And they specifically, as I read in those quotes in my video, specifically targeted Russians and Christians specifically. And the book I read, Sean McMeekin's Russian Revolution, he points this out. And to be honest with you, he tries to hide this a lot of the times, that there was not only the Jewish Bolshevik Revolution, but that behind the scenes, whether it was FDR's administration or Winston Churchill, they were controlled by groups like what's called the Focus, who were these guys who were like Jewish bankers and Jewish like businessmen who were paying off Winston Churchill to start a war with Germany and to do things like that. And then was one thing that cracks me up in Sean McMeekin's book I'm reading right now, Stalin's War, is there was conversations between the Germans and the United States, and like pretty good ones. And then no joke, the book just goes, even though he admitted that Soviet spies had completely run rampant in FDR's administration, apparently FDR, after talking to the Germans and having a great conversation, the next day just shows up and goes, oh, by the way, conversation over and we're not working with you. And Sean McMeekin goes, and we don't know why that happened. And I'm like, come on, Sean. I'm like, just say it, man. You know what it is. Okay. You don't. And I know why he doesn't do it, right? You don't want to scream the J's. You just don't want to do it. Right. And because if you point that out, his book wouldn't be printed. Right. So, and I understand that. And I sympathize with that. But that's what happened, so not only once you understand that, yes, there was a lot of Jewish influence, a lot of Jewish revolutionaries who were both in the Bolshevik Revolution kind of running the show. And then you actually find there's a lot of Jewish like power and influence in the Western powers. It really makes the narrative make sense on why these guys were just so dang aggressive against Hitler. And why, when Hitler speaks in his speeches, especially in 1939, 1940, he says, I don't want a war with Great Britain. I don't want a war with France, and I don't want a war with the United States. My aims are to the east. But you guys are so influenced by Jewish power and money, you won't let it go. And he's not wrong. That's the crazy part, is that Hitler's not wrong. And that's what's scary, right? That's what's so
someone's going to clip that. Someone's going to clip.
It's kind of freaky,
Yeah. Oh, I guess into such scary territory.
And that's what scared me, reading this stuff and figuring it out. And I just started to go, holy crap. Like, but he's right. And this is confirmed not by far right extremist historians, but regular down the middle revisionist historians like Sean McMeekin, who's just admitting what it was. And he doesn't even go far enough sometimes. I sometimes kind of roll my eyes at some of his stuff because I'm like, come on, Sean, I know you know what the truth is. Just say it, But yeah, so that's like kind of a big piece. It's just how much Jewish influence there really was. It's really true.
Now we got a shock and horror. We got a critic in the chat here, but I think it's actually perfect timing because it demonstrates one of the key problems in modern inability to discuss this matter. So we have someone with these Japanese letters, I think.
Yes.
I think these are Japanese letters. Yeah. Ohayo gozaimasu, my friend. He says militant guy sounds like Jews all evil. How do you respond to that?
Well, the thing is, especially if you watch my video, I always say this, right? And this is what Alexander Solzhenitsyn said. He said, not all of the Jews were communists or Bolsheviks, but the Bolshevik Revolution would have never happened without the Jews.
Yep.
And he specifically says, and they don't like that truth. And that's just true, you know?
Mhm.
And it's
Yep.
true with the infiltrating in Spain, where they were killing so many people, and in Germany causing a havoc and causing chaos. And it's not that they're all evil. It's just a crazy disproportionate amount of them, fluctuating between 50 to 90% in whatever movement and revolution in whatever country were just Jewish, even though they were only 1 to 4% of the population in every single country. And like, that has to be talked about, because that's important to understand, because then you won't understand World War II and the interwar period, and even World War I to a point.
Yep.
And the other thing I always said in my video too was, I bet if I showed these quotes that I read on my podcast to regular Jewish people I know, and I read them to them, they would be like, what are you smoking? What the heck is that? That can't be true. Because you want to know why?
Yeah.
Because those people aren't like that. But one thing I will say about those Jewish people I do know, they tend to be liberal, and they tend to be more on the left. And I don't think that's a coincidence. And I said, those Jewish intelligentsia who did get kicked out did come to America. And I think they just influenced a whole new generation of people, including their own people. And like, I think that's fair to say. I don't think that's out of line. And no, of course I don't think all Jews are evil, but you know, it's the point of my show is, who are our enemies ideologically, theologically, and politically? And sadly, and I say this about even the black people in this country who tend to be more left, they just are. And they tend to be in those categories, my enemies. Now, as people, of course, I can be friends, but right. Well, once again, you have to understand the context you're in. And that's essentially what I've come to understand. It's not all Jews are evil, but they admit. I even showed a video of a Jewish woman saying, I'm Jewish and proud because the gay, sex, and abortion, you know?
Yeah. Oh yeah. It was that what was it? World Jewish Congress or something?
Yes.
That YouTube short. I think you showed it on your video, but I knew of it before as well.
Yeah.
Where Jewish activist groups will proudly say, yes, we Jews did this. So it's not even a question of big bad Nazi boys saying, oh, the Jews did all these problems. Jews themselves say it. And they're proud of it. Well, they obviously don't think they're problems. They think they're good things. Unless there's certain ones higher up the chain who are like, no, we know that these things are bad and they destroy nations, but we want to promote that for that reason. But ultimately, this comment here by this guy and this next one here as well, so that justified the mass murder of Jews still. Why women and children targeted? Obviously doesn't follow at all. No one is promoting that. But in the end, it just shows that comments like this, how people are just incapable of having these discussions with maturity, because they can't think outside of a very individualist metaphysic, where if you speak of a group like, oh, this group did this, then for most modern people, that's an accusation that every single individual in that class personally did that thing, which is ridiculous. That's not how anyone thought before the modern world. People were before the modern age, before the 20th century, and even during the 20th century, for crying out loud, people were fine with talking about general group behaviors, patterns, dynamics, and what have you, and yet did not think that therefore meant every single individual did this. The Bible speaks in that way. The Bible says the Jews killed Christ. It does say that explicitly. Acts 2:36. Peter, a Jew, an ethnic Jew, preaching to the crowd of Jews in Jerusalem. And it wasn't just the Jerusalem Jews, by the way. It explicitly specifies this is in Pentecost, and Jews from across the world, as far as Parthia, or Iran, for modern day reference, were coming to Jerusalem. And Peter says to all of them, you sons of Israel crucified Christ. Now, did the Parthian Jew man and his why did I say Jew man? Did the Parthian Jew and his proselyte, because it even adds, and their proselytes, were they personally in the crowd that called for Christ to be killed? Were they even in Jerusalem at the time? Probably not. And yet, the people as a whole did that, because it's not about every single individual. It's about a group thing. And even in this case, as you said, and I can concur as well. If you showed many modern Jews those quotes from like Jewish elite back in the old times, they'd probably be absolutely shocked by that. And so one could even make the reasonable argument it's largely centered on the Jewish intelligentsia and what have you, as the terminology you use. But in either case, this is just the kind of dialoguing and level of discourse that needs to happen if anyone's going to address it with any maturity. That's kind of the problem.
Yeah, and the reason why the other reason why I even made this video too was because, you know, especially at my old church, I was heavily involved in the whole race discussion thing, and just nobody wanted to be honest about it. And that's why I got so frustrated. And that's why I'm kind of trying to jump ahead on something like this, because it's like there just has to be honesty about this, because I'm genuinely scared, because there's a lot of comparisons today, right? There's a lot of comparisons. There's a lot of Jewish people in entertainment, like pornography, business, and, you know, the Federal Reserve is like, you know, it's been mostly run by Jewish people, a lot of financing. And I'm scared is that people, as if things get worse, that people are going to start doing the same thing again, and we're just going to have a repeat, you know? And that's kind of why I'm like, dude, we have to be honest about this. Like, you can point out who the bad guys are, and we don't have to go after the whole group here, you know? And
exactly.
we just have to call this out. And if that means even calling out like Jewish people who we live near, or even ideologically in our country today, and tell them to chill out, you know, like we need to do that, especially as Christians, because like, no, I don't want them sent to camps or even exiled. But, you know, that's just, but that's what is possible if this doesn't get under control, and people start getting angrier and angrier and start looking at different groups. And that's what I found with the whole first woke problem with the race stuff. Like, everyone was just treating, especially at like the church I was going to, like they were treating the topic with kitty gloves, and even sometimes doing like the Matt Chandler thing where they're treating black people as if they're like, you know, they have deity in the moment. And I just was like, this is just not how we're going to fix this. Like, you know what I mean? It's just, and that's why this has to be discussed and talked about, and just like, just constantly have to warn young guys, you can know your enemy, just don't spurg out. You know, just don't spurg, because people really get crazy on this topic, you know. And even with that guy, I have 14-year-olds who can handle this conversation better than you at this point. No offense, man, but like I have high schoolers who are crushing it. I showed them all the same info, and they handled it wonderful, you know. So get a grip, man.
Yeah, that's great. Excellent stuff.
One last thing before, like, I just want to even say this. The other reason why I made the video was the other thing Doug Wilson was doing is, and I thought Andrew did a good job, is the fact when he kept comparing how Jewish people were disproportionately in pornography, but then he kept saying, yeah, but they're also like chess players. That was the other thing I kind of missed in the beginning of this. I was like, dude, Doug, stop it, man.
That's literally...
I get so
Doug Wilson would oppose that same logic with arguments for mass migration. Oh, look, there's literal hordes of foreigners flooding the border in all directions and destroying societal cohesion. But the food, though.
I know.
Same argument.
And that's why I get frustrated with him on this topic, because I'm like, he's so consistent on so many other things. Like, he's really brilliant on so many things. It's just like with this one topic, he all of a sudden just has a completely different standard on a lot of stuff. And that was one of them, where he was just like, yeah, you know, so what, the Jewish people are really involved in pornography, and they are today. Who cares? You know, like, we have brain surgeons. And Andrew did a really good job, and I essentially asked him, like, don't you think, like, on a scale, like, that's going to be, you know, you can't really balance that out. Like, hasn't pornography had more of an impact than brain surgery? And Doug said no. And I just was like, that's not good enough. That's not good enough. Like, that you can't, like, what are you going to tell that to a 20-year-old German living in 1923? He would completely laugh in your face. You know, while you actually had communist Jewish revolutionaries running around in Germany in 1923. If Doug gave that argument to a young German man, he'd be like, what? Get up out of here. You're crazy. You know, like, you can't just be like, well, they have chess. You know, they're brain surgeons. It's like, dude. Like, I'm telling you, if that was 100 years ago with a German man, he would laugh in his face. He'd be like, dude, you're crazy. You know, so that was another thing I forgot to add. That was one part too.
Yeah. So ultimately, to sum it all up for people, whatever conclusions you land in on this topic, whether you disagree with every single point that that Saint Militant and myself make here and all that jazz on the particular points of historical claims, the metaphysics of whether the Jews as a people are guilty for something or what have you. Nonetheless, what we at least hope you get out of this is that you grant that there needs to be a betterment of categories for discussion in this thing, because one thing does not necessarily lead to the other. Unlike what a Japanese name commenter here was assuming, that when Saint Militant or myself speak of, oh, well, the Jews did X bad thing or what have you in the past, or they tend to do this or that bad thing, and that immediately translates to, oh, so you hate all Jews, you want to see all Jews dead. No, that absolutely does not follow at all. Because again, people need to distinguish discussions of collectives versus every single individual or a particular individual. Those things must be distinguished. And again, ultimately, these are, well, actually, with the exception of the whole thing of the Jewish people killed Christ, that is revelatory history. And so I think there is particular importance of getting that right. Putting that to the side, though, everything else is post-revelatory history. And we need to be able to have such disagreements and dialogues with maturity and respect. And so even if you're one of the people in the comments who completely disagrees with myself and Militant's takes, we hope that you don't therefore think that our positions are anathema. Just as I don't think, or Militant doesn't think, that your more mainstream positions don't make you anathema as well. Again, unlike some who are very much more on the extreme in the dissident right. So with that said, take that framing as it is, and ultimately, our ultimate desire in the end, for people wondering in the chat as well, because why they even have to wonder is baffling to me. But yes, ultimately, we seek the salvation of the Jews. That's ultimately what we seek out in this, that we desire all men, whether you think that's every individual man, as Arminians tend to, or all kinds of people, it's the same. We seek the salvation of the Jews. Real hatred of the Jews, real sinful hatred of the Jews, is to not seek their salvation. Hear that, John Hagee? It is to deny them the path of salvation. It's to not seek that. The opposite, we do seek that. But that's not going to be effectively done if we are not honest with the history of the Jews, starting with what the Jewish people did to our Lord. Admitting that is a first step that's necessary. So with that said, what's another point? What's another point that you have of the narrative that you oppose?
The other narrative that I usually think of is the are you just talking like 20th century, or are we still kind of sticking around this time period too?
20th century the general post-war narrative.
Yeah.
We've probably said enough about the Jews.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I'm probably good with that. The one thing I'll say too is the whole like Hitler wanted world dominance. Like that has severe effects on our policy today, because like I said, they treat everybody as if they're Hitler. They always make that excuse, but yet, like, when you look at what Stalin was doing, it was like a million times worse. You know what I mean? And I know this is like why I've severely questioned, like, why do we pick? Why do we even get involved? Like, why don't we just let Germany fight the communists? Like, why not just let them do it? You know what I mean? And just stuff like that. But yeah, just like that kind of narrative in general of Hitler wanting world dominance, that's not true. The person who did want world dominance, like I said, was Stalin. He actually said that out loud. Like they're internationalist. Fascism is nationalist. Things like that. And just even just like that's why, like, even the fight going into the Cold War, like the narrative starts to kind of fall apart for me, because they kind of make it seem like it's capitalism, like Western democracy capitalism versus like communism. But the understanding I've kind of come to like reading a lot of material, especially of like the elites in general, like a Bertrand Russell or like Aldous Huxley, like kind of those kind of guys. Like those guys were essentially saying like they were all like Fabian socialists. And essentially what I think we see in Cold War is like almost like a form of like Fabian socialism versus like Bolshevik communism. Does that make sense?
No, it
Like,
makes a lot of sense because
I don't view the 20th century as capitalism versus communism. That's another thing I just let go of. You know what I mean? So.
Yeah, that one on Fabian socialism, that's actually what another friend of mine actually clued me into not too long ago. He personally, he doesn't spurg out about it. He can have a mature conversation about it, but he doesn't think that there was a particularly Jewish element or what have you in these past things. But he does talk a lot about the Fabian socialist thing.
Yeah.
And how, the way he explained it is that they basically were Hegelians who thus took the synthesis of capitalism and communism and basically created Fabian socialism from that. And that's how they're basically going to spread their revolution worldwide through not through a pure free market capitalism or through a communist revolution, but through like social democracy type systems, you know, mixed market type things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Like, have you ever read the book? It's called Conspirators Hierarchy, The Committee of 300. It's written by Dr. Joel Coleman. It's a really interesting book. It kind of scared me. I read like the first like 100 pages and I was like, heck no. Like I had to like shut it because like everything he predicted in 91 essentially like came true. And he essentially said that there's this group called the Committee of 300. This could be like the Rome Club. And like how these elites, essentially what you just said, that guy's like speaking my language. Like what I've come to really understand is that, and that's what this book is essentially saying, that there is this group of people who made these narratives up in the 20th century, especially about Hitler and like what happened with the fascists. And their intention was to essentially, use almost fascism to a point, like elements of it, to perpetuate like a one world government in a sense. And that's kind of a discussion I've been having with some other guys, that the era we live in today, it really just, I have no idea what to even call what we live under today. Like some people will call it neoliberalism, some will call it woke. There seems to be a little bit of a difference there, but like the era we live in is like truly a synthesis with communism, fascism, and liberalism. And like I don't know like what that is and where it's going, and what's going to respond to it. But I think the whole buildup of the 20th century, but especially after the communists fell in 91, like I just go like, it just seems like something morphed out of that, and that not necessarily capitalism won, but that, like I said, like Fabian socialism won, and is now like really extending its tentacles like as fast as possible. And hence why we're living in what we're living. And like, this is why, like I said, I even severely questioned the narrative on like 9/11. It happened. I think it's real, but there's a lot of evidence that, like they knew that these guys were flying and existing in America. They knew what they were doing, and it kind of seemed like they almost like let it happen in a sense. And like and even connects today, not to go too off the rails, but like you remember that attack from apparently ISIS in Russia like not long ago?
Yeah, the theater one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I honestly, when I heard it was ISIS, like we created ISIS. My first instinct was that's not ISIS. That was probably us or maybe some Ukrainian contingents. Now I'm not saying American soldiers, but and that's what I mean. Like, I think we sent them in there. Like, I think we probably gave them material and all of that because the United States is known for doing that. And that's what we've done throughout the 20th century. Like, Ho Chi Minh was funded by us, in Vietnam. And a lot of the communist revolutions throughout the world were funded by us. ISIS created by us. The Taliban was created by the United States. Like, even our ally in Israel made Hamas, so and in that book, that Committee of 300, this guy talks about how the United States, what these elites wanted to do is create a terrorist apparatus to make a continuous enemy and then use them as an excuse. So that's kind of why I even connected to World War II, because once you lose this intense nationalism, these global elites really got a foothold in the 20th century to just kind of go buck wild. Does that make sense?
That does make sense. Yeah.
All of that was kind of.
I'm echoing on your side for some reason.
What's that?
I was echoing on your side for some. Okay, no, I think it's all right. I was echoing a bit on your side. But
sorry if that was like
said,
incoherent. I have a tendency to do that, but like,
okay. I think someone gives here actually a pretty good summary of the modern situation. It took the corporatism from fascism, the rhetoric of socialism, the consumerism of neoliberalism, and meshed it up in a big single.
Yeah.
That's a good summary, I think.
What do you do with that?
Yeah, I personally just take the term. I personally just just extend the term anarcho-tyranny, which you've probably heard.
Yeah.
Where normally that just refers to like the direct tyrannical state of a government, but they use anarchy in the popular area to basically keep people manageable and not allow anything to consolidate and oppose the government's power. But honestly, I would extend the term even in times of greater peace earlier in the 20th and 21st centuries post-war in the West of greater relative peace, if you will. In those even in those times, I'd call the political situation. Excuse me. I'd call the political situation itself anarcho-tyranny, and how it relies on parliamentary or representative government systems that are just mega bureaucratic nightmares, dozens and tons and hundreds of government or like politicians and officials and what have you who run a government. And it's just a massive mess of differing interests and ideologies and what have you, all vying at each other. But there's ultimately still just a few puppet masters at the very top. Yeah. And they basically take advantage of just how much of a mess politics is to stop any real resistance in the political system.
Yeah. And that's why I said it always goes back to World War II, because World War II was the end of any type of right-wing nationalism. Like, it utterly destroyed it, because there were right-wing factions that rose up. Like, I just finished Suicide of the West from James Burnham, and like he points that out in like 1964. He says the United States only funds left-wing groups. That's it. Like, they don't fund right-wing groups. And I think that directly correlates to what happened in World War II. It was just that they have to keep this narrative of like any right-wing thought, it has to be stamped out, because nationalism will ruin like that global plan. And like that's kind of why it always goes back to that. I think that's why people are obsessed with World War II right now, because I think we're all just kind of realizing on the right wing, like, oh yeah, our ancestors just kind of got destroyed, essentially, like ideologically, you know what I mean? Yeah. Like, they got obliterated and they lost. And like, that is kind of a crazy thought, and it allowed room for pretty much all type of leftist nonsense to just run rampant. And it's just the basic language that we live in the basic world that we live in. It's just everyone is pretty much liberal. That's kind of what I've come to conclude, without even knowing it. Like, people who call themselves conservatives, a lot of times they're just usually very liberal, you know? And
yeah, exactly.
It always goes back to that, to World War II, and just that narrative of Hitler was crazy, when in reality it was a much more complicated situation. You know, there was almost a alternate timeline where Soviet Union invaded Finland, and all the Western powers, and then including the Middle East, almost invaded the USSR over it. You know, like, it's kind of crazy, but you know, that's just they don't tell you that, but that's just kind of what happened. So
absolutely it's unfortunate. Any other points you want to talk about? Or
man, I'm not sure. There's I'm probably good. I feel like I'm rambling a little bit, so
too easy. Yeah. So now we move on probably to the most pertinent question, like why any of this matters for Christians as Christians, period. So how would you say this narrative in general, not whether it's specific points or not, but I guess preferably just the narrative in general, as we both summarized it a bit earlier, how does that contradict the nature of the Christian faith? And how do you think Christians, what do you think Christians can do? Well, actually, we'll just start with that first one. How do you think it contradicts the nature of our faith?
Well, it definitely contradicts it firstly, because it's a lie, right? So the narrative is a lie. And so we're supposed to stand for the truth, but it contradicts the faith, because Christianity, I remember my wife's grandmother said this, that Christians are like the first line of defense for any society. Like once we start really weakening, it just gets crazy. And we kind of let people go buck wild. And that's always kind of how we end up with these really horrific events. And Christians are supposed to be active in their country and in their nation. And this narrative tells you not to do that, to not be proud of your nation, to not be proud of your people, keep your faith to yourself. When in reality, the Bible contradicts all of that. Like the apostles went out and came in contact with people, right? Paul went to the synagogues and debated and was confrontational. And all of these people who got pretty much got converted, they all cared about their nation. I mean, like John Knox was like, what was it, like give me Scotland and give me death or something like that. Just something kind of like a phrase like that, but like we've kind of lost that, and this narrative just tells you to be like as just being a Christian in this pluralistic society that has no meaning, and just do whatever that makes you happy and don't have any roots and just float through society. And sure, maybe tell Jesus that he's cool and stuff, but don't get too crazy about it. And also, Christians, don't get involved in politics, because that's too far right and that scares people. So that's a huge part, is that it's just a massive lie, and it definitely contradicts the faith, because it essentially tells you to sit down and shut up. And I always relate it back to the church that I used to go to, because that's essentially what evangelicals told me to do. And this is why I don't call myself an evangelical. A lot of times I cut myself out from a lot of evangelicals, because they follow that narrative. They just sit there, they go to church, listen to a TED Talk for an hour, kind of go home and just do it all over again, And so that narrative tells you to do that. Don't be strong and just sit down and shut up. And that is not what Christians are supposed to do. It's the opposite.
Absolutely.
So.
Absolutely true. And even one of the direct pertinent things, again, to bring it back to this thing, even though we left it behind a little bit earlier, one thing where the narrative does directly, like it, not just in the sense that it's a lie, but or that it tells us to be rootless and what have you, not have devotion to our particular heritage and what have you, and other points. But even one of the most direct attacks of the modern narrative on the faith itself is what is explicitly taught in Scripture. Again, the people of Israel as a collective, as a whole, crucified Christ. Obviously, people can talk about the Thessalonians passage from Paul and try to cope their way around that. But the Peter's own statement, Acts chapter 2, verse 36, is the most clearest, given that his referent is explicitly the whole people of Israel. And he says that you crucified Christ. And unfortunately, given recent developments with the whole the whole anti-Semitism bill, which before it was passed federally in the United States, I followed it. It was passed in South Carolina, which basically said anti-Semitism bad according to the definition of, what is it, the International Holocaust Remembrance, something like that.
Oh gosh.
And that definition, they call it a working definition, but the fact that it's actually enshrined in the code now, as far as I've read both the South Carolina law and the federal law, it didn't say their definition as of this date, but just a blank check. So if that organization just changes their definition to be even more vacuous than it already is, which frankly, I don't know how it can be. It basically says that definition, people should read it. It basically says anything Jews don't like is anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
But even more pertinent, it actually directly cites that biblical statement that they killed Christ in its list of examples of anti-Semitic tropes. And so, and that's directly resultant, of course, from the dominance of the model narrative. And thank you, Hype, International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. I thought it was okay. Yeah, I'll take it for that, but that should be it. But in any event, that's something that directly attacks scriptural witness, and obviously that scriptural witness doesn't say, therefore you need to spit on every Jew you walk past and what have you. Therefore, you can't have relationship. You can't have real world friendships with unbelieving Jews and what have you. Obviously, none of that follows from that. And if people learn to think in clear distinctions, they would take that for granted. But unfortunately, that is something directly attacked by the modern narrative, that clear scriptural truth. And so clear scriptural teaching is under threat as well. And so that's really an extra incentive that people have to oppose it.
And this is why, once again, I did the episode, because I can't emphasize enough that Christians should not support those anti-Semitism bills. Because just to let you know, guys, that is straight out of Trotsky's playbook. One of the first things they did when they got into office is Trotsky, who was Jewish, made an anti-Semitism law like instantly. That was like one of the first things they put in the Soviet Union. And they did that because what they did is anytime you criticized Jewish people, because most of them were in the Bolshevik Revolution, they connected it to going against the party or communism. So if you're against that group of people, you're against communism. Like, they made that link, and they put you in prison for it. And like, that kind of seems like it's almost out of the same playbook. And like, that's why I keep saying I'm getting real nervous, because it's almost like a play-by-play what's going on in our country right now. And it's like, it's really scary, you know. That's why I'm like, we gotta get this under control, because if somebody doesn't, like, this is gonna get wild, you know. So at least in the United States.
Absolutely true. So, and before I hit the final question, reminder people, Q&A is coming up right after this last question, so post your questions there right now. And if you're a local supporter, put it in the locals stream post that I just put up during the stream, and put your questions there if you're a supporter, so that I can clearly differentiate you from others. Now, final question, very final one. In light of how this modern narrative is a threat to the Christian faith, notwithstanding it being a threat to the integrity of Western nations as nations, but to the faith itself, how can Christians, in your estimations, fight back against it?
Well, the way I've fought against it is, first of all, what actually started my path was like sola scriptura, was just like knowing God's word. And I'm not trying to do the stereotypical, you know what I mean? Like, I'm not trying to be like stereotypical, but like, seriously, like the reason why I could go into this history and not get sucked in was because I had a foundation. I had sola scriptura as my, you know, just following God's word. Having good theology really helped. Like, I have a shirt that says theology matters. Like, I'm one of those goofballs. You know what I mean? Like, I wear it very proudly, right? I really do. I think it's because I had a good theology and I knew God's word, that when I started going into these territories that are dangerous, like fascism, right? Like, studying it and reading these kinds of histories, I can go into this and be able to navigate it, because that's the only way you're going to be able to really navigate this. That's one way. And then, of course, one way is educating yourself on these topics, going into them logically, letting go of a lot of boundaries that you might have placed on yourself at first. Things like that, going into this, like letting yourself being like, okay, what are they actually saying? That's kind of what I mean, like letting boundaries go. Because once I actually started to read Hitler for what he was saying, not what I wanted him to say, and all these other fascists, I could actually navigate it. And Christians can then use this knowledge and really actually take that to the public square, and to actually be able to educate people, and can actually turn the tide. And because I think that's kind of what's happening. I think what people are realizing is that we have been lied to. You can navigate these waters. You can talk about these things, and you don't have to be a crazy person. And if you do have a good foundation, you can learn from those mistakes. So like, if we start going down this route again in this country, we don't have to go this super far right fascist route, right? We don't have to exile people. We don't have to put them in camps. Christians can actually step in, honestly talk about it, and actually engage with the culture and pretty much dominate it, because their lives are going to fall apart. And that's what's happening right now, is the narrative is collapsing, and people are looking through it, and they're pulling things together, like myself. I think others are starting to do this, and Christians can be the ones that can actually have answers to these questions. To go back to the first part, was because we have God's word, we can use it. I I always love Justinian, right? He used God's word to build law. King Alfred did this. Like, we have the capabilities of doing this. We've done it in the past. We can learn from it. We don't have to make that mistake. It really just comes down to knowing what you're talking about. And that's why I'm very critical of, like, you know, just the more evangelical space, because I find them to be extremely uneducated. Hence why when I was in an evangelical church, I was begging for education, and was denied it, to be honest with you. And so that's what it's going to come down to, is Christians knowing this stuff, taking this information and then using it to help others to grow, and then be able to fight this culture and to push it back, because we've lost a lot of our heritage. I think that's what young men are frustrated about. I know that's what I'm frustrated about, but I am hopeful that especially young men seem to be going more conservative and more far right. And I think once that starts to happen, a lot of the women will start to come too, which would be really cool. I don't know if that all made sense, but
that made perfect sense. I completely agree. I think you pretty much said everything that needs to be said. Well, actually, I will add one thing as well. From the attempts that people made to cancel me, because I actually made a Twitter post back last October, basically on all this. I literally just decided at a whim at my workplace. I got there early, like early in the morning, and I was sitting on the couch in the lunch area, and I was like, you know what, stuff it, I'm gonna make this post, and I posted it, and it blew the hell up, like massively. For people who don't know, it's my post. It's my post basically where I said it is okay. It is in principle okay for a Christian to question the big event history, and even as well as the nature of Mustache Man himself, Adolf Hitler.
yeah.
It is in principle okay for people to study those historical things and to come to even complete opposite conclusions of the modern idea. Because precisely for what I mentioned here, it's post-revelatory history and what have you. That blew the hell up. A lot of angry comments and quote tweets. A lot of people came out supporting me as well, but a lot of angry comments and quote tweets from people who just, I'll just be straight up, are not capable of the basic intellectual thought. People couldn't make any distinction, what have you. And so that was basically an attempt to cancel me, as Emperor Palpatine said. The attempt on my life has left me scarred and deformed, but I survived it. I survived it just fine. And in fact, I came out. That was pretty much like an inoculation. Like, I got exposed to a big virus, a cancellation attempt. Came out the other end just fine, and I'm still up. I'm still standing, and so I'm kind of immune to it, at least to a certain degree of it. But in any event, I made that post. And I came out and I survived it. But what I'd say is that from this, and I can speak from experience, this isn't just me saying it from behind a nice keyboard, comfy and cushy or whatever. No, I actually experienced this. Our people, if you're someone who's involved in the public space in these things, obviously not everyone is. Many Christians are of a station where it's just fine for you to fly under the radar and to do your duty as a Christian. But you must always be ready to make the right confession, no matter the consequences. But with that said, if you are a Christian public figure, whether a priest or a content maker or what have you, and these issues do come up, you need to be more than willing to go up and defend the truth on these positions, even if it means your utter cancellation. That is a kind of fortitude that so many Christian leaders just lack today. But it needs to happen. If there's going to be any success in changing our world for the better, it needs to include saying the truth, even truths which are in themselves not super meaningful for the daily Christian life, yet which are biblical truths nonetheless, which are under assault. We need to be willing to defend those publicly as public figures, as priests, as podcasters, and what have you, even if it means the destruction of our social circles and our social reputation. So that's an additional thing on top of what you said that I would add to people and encourage people to do. Yeah. And so with that, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to jump straight into Q&A. Not as many questions that I expected, but still a few. And so we'll get started. We'll get started onto that. The Reformed Arminian, he gave this question a bit earlier, but he also expanded on it a little bit later. So I'll go with him first. No supporter or super chat questions from what I see so far. He asks, I guess he asked me, but I guess you can answer too. Have you looked at the political difference between different groups of Jews, Eastern European versus Western European? Sowell went over how radical Eastern European Jews were politically, while those in England, France, and Germany tended to fit into the culture ex or Disraeli. Are you familiar with the work? I don't really have any learning in that. Militant, do you have any understanding?
Not necessarily. The only thing I have to question with that though is those three countries, especially England, France, and Germany, they all got kicked out.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right. Right.
Like my kind of response to that is like, I don't doubt that's true, but I just know like England has booted them out. I know France booted them out, and Germany definitely booted them out too. So that's why I'm kind of like, yeah, that's why when I read that, I think that's a little interesting because yeah, I know for a fact that this is true, that one thing that did happen in Nazi Germany that was really interesting was there were German Jews living there. And then there was a bunch of Eastern Jews who were coming into Germany, and they were the really radical ones. And I think that's kind of what this is saying. So maybe that's what he's talking about, because yeah, the Eastern ones seem to be the more radicalized. But like I said, they did get kicked out of those three countries specifically. I don't know if it was because they were politically radical. I think it had more to do with like economics, right. Like usury. I think that's like that's the tendency you usually find when they do get kicked out. It's usually connected with that. But that's interesting. Yeah, that's actually true. I know there was a fight between the German Jews and then the Eastern Jews who were coming into Germany. I know that's true. Hence why some Jews actually started supporting the National Socialists, which is pretty interesting.
Fair enough. This one's interesting. It may call for speculation, so if you don't want to give a full-on answer, that's fine. But I'll show it anyway. Question then to clarify: what would be the ideal problem solving during World War II, or even slightly before the start of the war, etc.? Outright prevent the war itself, arm the non-Nazi Germans, etc.
What would the ideal problem solving during World War II? Well, I could tell you this: Great Britain probably could have probably worked better with Germany. Hitler himself would make like 22 proposals to like not go to war, and Winston Churchill, remember, owned by the Focus, was indebted to them, wanted war. Is that kind of what he's asking?
I guess like how would you have prevented World War II? I guess like could things have been done better, differently? I guess.
Oh my gosh, I have no idea. What? I don't know. Well, that's what I'm just saying. I do lay a lot of the blame of World War II at mostly at Britain's feet for a lot of this, because if you look at a lot of the proposals, when Hitler was invading Poland and Czechoslovakia, they were actually really like soft, and Hitler was constantly criticized by even his own guys for being too soft many times. For example, like Hitler took Czechoslovakia and Poland, but that was mostly because they were like, ethnic cleansing them, the ethnic Germans that were stuck in those countries. And essentially every proposal was Hitler was like, hey, I'll take those lands, and then if you work with me, I will give them back, essentially. That's pretty that was like what I've been reading in like Stalin's war, that's pretty accepted. Even at one point, secretly, like Hitler and Stalin were even working together at one point. But
Molotov-Ribbentrop.
What's that? Yes.
Molotov-Ribbentrop.
Yeah, that was like a whole thing too. But yeah, I blame it a lot on like Great Britain, because they could have avoided a lot of problems. And even a lot of the politicians that were existing in England at the time were admitting like, hey, the Treaty of Versailles was pretty bad. It's unfair. Germany's just taking back German territory. If you look into like the Polish government, they were being pretty abusive, kind of sticking up the middle finger to like everybody. Like, you know what I mean? So I don't even know how I would have prevented it, but I'm definitely sure that if Great Britain wasn't so hostile towards Germany and Hitler got the dreamed about alliance that he wanted, I think it would have been a very different situation. And I think the whole world probably would have turned on the USSR, actually, which almost happened, like I said. So
Yeah, yeah. I haven't done a huge amount of reading myself, so I can only give like a qualified agreement, I guess. Um, Question for Militant: how do we participate in politics when our people are immoral and will only vote for the wrong things, abortion, LGBTQ plus, for
That's a
instance?
that's a really good question. Yeah, once again, it's just kind of going to come down to just patience. And look, it might not even happen if I'm going to be very blunt. Like America could just keep going down the path. You know what I mean? Just being honest, it could just be going down this crazy path. But of course, the answer you can start with is, I guess, local. I'm kind of more in the camp of just, I think the only way this is probably going to turn around is if it's going to come from the elite. You know what I mean? I'm not the only one who thinks that. Like, it's going to have to come out as probably someone out of there. Hitler's kind of a weird case because he came from the bottom, right? He was homeless and then it kind of started from there. But when it comes to Christians, I think on a local level, you can definitely do something. I know that's why I'm in Christian education, to like start helping with the next generation and things like that. But yeah, I mean, it's not like you can stop other people, right? Just engaging is the best way you can do it, I guess. But yeah, I totally understand like that question. Like, how do we participate when it's kind of like everybody's insane? You know what I mean? Because like I said, even in the church, if you say anything right wing, people absolutely lose their mind. So we're just gonna have to play the long game. The communists played the long game. I think the right wing's gonna have to try to play the long game somewhat. But the only thing I can really say to that is, I guess, start local. Do what you can just with the people around you. You know what I mean?
Yep. Completely agreed. Completely agreed. Truth is Beautiful says the League of Militant is more of a comment. I want to see if you have a response. The League of Militant Godless under the communists attacked the religion of Judaism relentlessly. Saint Militant didn't mention that. You have any idea about this, or?
Yeah. So what's really funny is in the beginning of the Bolshevik Revolution, they were right super like it was like a Jewish revolution. But it is true that the communists, I would actually argue, when Stalin got in, is when that kind of attitude did start to change somewhat, and they did attack Jews afterwards. Like, that is something to admit. But there was even a big fight between Trotsky and Lenin at one point in the beginning of the revolution, where Trotsky and Lenin almost split the Bolsheviks because of the Jewish thing. Because Lenin essentially said, "Hey, we got to give up this Jewish identity thing because we're Soviets now. We're communists. We need to be like one kind of blob communists, right?" And Trotsky was like, I'm not doing that." And the one quote from my presentation, Trotsky even says that, right? If we win this revolution, Zionism will essentially rise out of the ashes. So Trotsky was more, I think this is why Stalin got rid of him, to be honest with you. I think that's a piece of it, is that Trotsky, I think, was probably too focused on that, whereas I think Lenin and Stalin, especially Stalin, was probably just more power politic and just didn't need that anymore. So yeah, they definitely went after Jews at points, but not in the beginning. Definitely not in the beginning.
Makes sense. Makes sense.
It does, yeah.
Spicy one. What is your opinion about Kevin McDonald's work on the question? The question, uppercase
Kevin
Q.
McDonald. Who's Kevin McDonald?
He has this series of books called Culture of Critique. I think he basically has an argument of actually a genetic basis of Jewish group strategy and behavior. So yeah.
I have heard of him. I actually have heard of this guy. I've never read his stuff, so I actually don't know. I'm sorry.
Fair enough. All good. All good. From my man Jeff Robinson, also known as a Goy for Jesus. We have a potentially awesome interview happening soon, by the way, so stay tuned. Question: why did the apostles only preach to Jews that they murdered Jesus in Jerusalem? No record of that in the diaspora. I definitely have an answer for that. But
yeah, I was going to say, you can answer if you want.
Sure, yeah. Well, in that case, I'd say that, well, actually, he did. Peter preached in Jerusalem. Well, first and foremost, the problem of silence. In the end, we don't have many sermons from the apostles to the diaspora at all. Let alone that even of those that we do have, and they're mainly just letters anyway. It's not like that. Oh, you people killed Christ is a relevant point of the message anyway. I don't think anyone here is saying that oh, the Jews killed Christ is like part of the Apostles' Creed or whatever. It's something you necessarily have to bring up. But what is important is that he actually did preach it to the diaspora as well, because it is in Acts chapter 2 where it specifically specifies on the day of Pentecost that there are Jews from across the world, again, even from Persia, if memory serves correct, and their proselytes gathered in Jerusalem there. And it is to those people, so Jerusalem Jews and Jews from across the world, he preaches to them and says, "Men of Israel, you crucified Christ." So I would actually say that yes, we do have explicit apostolic testimony to the Jewish people as a whole, not merely the Jerusalem Jews crucifying Christ. So I disagree with that. That's my answer. Do you have anything to add, or?
No, I thought that's kind of what I was thinking was the Acts 2 thing. Was that that was kind of what I went to first, but I thought you nailed that.
Yeah. Honestly, I don't know why I guess I kind of know why the Thessalonians passage is the more popular one for people who want to argue that, oh, look, Paul says, he talks about the Jews who killed Christ or whatever. But I don't know why the Acts 2 one, and the Acts 2 one should be the more popular one, because that one's much more explicit and it's immune from it's immune from the usual like copes people give around it, like, oh, he's just talking about the leaders. Like, no. He's talking to the people. So yeah. With that said, thank you for that question, Jeff. We wouldn't have had World War II if it wasn't for the craptastic job of Woodrow Wilson. Your thoughts? I have no idea. Militant, for you?
So Woodrow Wilson, the thing with him was, he was like super idealistic. He actually kind of set the tone for the whole like giving weapons to terrorists kind of thing. Like he gave weapons to like Pancho Villa down in Mexico because Pancho Villa was against the dictator in Mexico. So Woodrow Wilson's like, hey, why don't we give him weapons? So that's kind of where that whole thing comes from, by the way. And it's been in U.S. policy ever since. But yeah, I mean, Woodrow Wilson, you could say to a point, but the thing is come to find out, even when it came to the Treaty of Versailles, like when they were creating Czechoslovakia and Poland, like when they were kind of bringing those nations back, it's come to find out the British and the French were actually showing Woodrow Wilson fake maps. And so when those Germans got stuck in Czechoslovakia and Poland, someone did bring that up to him, and he legitimately like responded like, "Oh, I just didn't know." Because come to find out, Britain and France were actually lying to Woodrow Wilson. And you got to remember too, Woodrow Wilson kind of walked out on the Treaty of Versailles. Like he gave the 16 points, and I think only about one made it in there. I'm trying to remember which one it is. But he essentially walked out on that treaty, hence why we didn't join the League of Nations, because of how punishing they were on the Germans. Like Woodrow Wilson, like specifically said, we're not going to do that. So I wouldn't really blame it on Woodrow Wilson. If anything, it actually kind of made him look stupid. He died like not too long after that, and he was pretty embarrassed politically by that event. And so I personally wouldn't put it on Woodrow Wilson. Once again, I lay a lot of the blame of World War II mostly at Great Britain's feet, because they were kind of a dying empire and they kind of made a lot of mistakes when they really didn't need to. So that's how I would put it.
That makes sense. I
don't like Woodrow Wilson, by the way. I think Woodrow Wilson stinks, but I wouldn't blame him for a lot of it, to be honest, just personally.
Fair enough. Now we have a question from a supporter, from my legendary supporter, Leroy. Pat Buchanan's book has already been mentioned, but can Saint Militant please recommend what he believes to be the 5 best written works which tackle the post-World War II liberal narrative?
Yeah, so the one I'm reading now is Stalin's War. That's one. The one I really like too is The Grave Diggers. That one isn't necessarily against the liberal narrative, but it's a really good breakdown of like what happened and how Hitler gained power. The 4th one I would probably put, it's not necessarily a World War II liberal narrative, but I actually would recommend Suicide of the West by James Burnham, because he does talk about World War II and he does talk about Hitler a lot, and pretty much everything, a lot of things I'm even saying, James Burnham just kind of points out. That's another one. I'm trying to think of a 5th. I don't know about a 5th, but those are like the 4 I found were like in a row that I read were like extremely helpful as of right now, because to be honest with you, even the ones I'm recommending aren't even necessarily like punching super hard on the liberal World War II narrative, if I was to be honest with you, but they give enough information that you can kind of see through it, that it's a revisionist enough. You know what I mean?
Right.
That a lot of it is pretty enlightening. So that's kind of like the 4 books like in connection to each other that I would put, like especially with Suicide of the West, it kind of gave me the ability to see through the liberal narrative, because it then allowed me to read history kind of through that lens. Does that make sense?
That does make sense. Yeah. Would you recommend, as a primary source reading, would you recommend people read Mein Kampf to get the words from the big man himself?
100%. It's not
Yeah.
even that exciting. He even has a second book, by the way.
Really?
Yes, Hitler does have a second book, and a lot of it is him talking about his fear with America. That he actually predicted that America would probably get involved in the war, and he was trying to avoid it. That's who he was scared of the most. Like, if you read a lot of his speeches, he was scared of America the most joining the war. Especially, he would have almost point by point speeches against FDR, who would be making point by point speeches against Hitler. Like, they were kind of having like a back and forth. It's really funny. But yeah, Mein Kampf, the problem is like you can't really find it anymore. Archive.org, I think, has it. That's like a majority of where I read it. Just to let you know, it's not that entertaining, because it's essentially him breaking down what the National Socialists actually believe, and it's essentially just the National Socialist political program. So it's not even that. People make it seem like it's this insane book, but really in reality, it's just like the first quarter is like his life and where he got, and like how he got here and where he is now in that situation while in prison, and what he was like as a boy. And then he essentially then goes into the not tirade, but then he essentially goes into what do National Socialists believe and why you should support us. And he even has some pretty crazy quotes, like paraphrasing, that they like to try to edit out, like things like, I don't hate other races. I actually respect Japan and China a lot because they're older than ours, but I want my nation to be my nation, and I want their nation to be their nation. It's like stuff like that, like stuff
Wow, that's
you
a
would
very
never
different
heard
picture.
before. Yeah, it's a totally different narrative that you're told, but it's like 800 pages. Like, who wants to read that? You know what I mean? It's like super
Yeah.
long. That's why I said I've only read like really large chunks of it, because to be honest with you, there's times where he just kind of trudges along, and but there is some good stuff there. But I would recommend that. Like, any first sources, like Goebbels' diaries are really good. Those are really interesting. He's a really weird guy. He's an interesting dude. Yeah, just stuff like that.
Yeah, I because I've actually been wanting to find a decent copy or translation of Mein Kampf for myself. I eventually want to learn German, of course, because that's just me.
Yeah,
I'm
of
a
course.
linguophile,
I took it
so
in
I
high
can
school.
get straight to it. But in the meantime, I do want to find. I was looking for a reliable English translation, and that was the thing I feared. The thing of translation methodology. I mean, again, given that Hitler is the Satan of the modern religion, I have a very strong fear that many modern translators would make him sound worse than he actually is, or even I've even been told by some that certain editions straight up excise whole pages from the text, which they don't want people to see. I haven't looked into that myself, but I fear of that possibility, and so I inquired to people who know a lot more than me, who are actually more sober minded about this, as to like what's the best translation to go with. And from what I've been recommended, there's the Thomas Dalton translation, which at least volume 1 is on archive.org. I think the second one maybe as well. But either way, that's what I've been recommended to people, and that's what I'll use when I start to read it myself.
Yeah.
But if others want to look that up, that's the one that you probably want to look for.
Yeah, because the other translations, I know they edit out a lot of stuff. That's one thing I do know, is that anything, like they do edit out a lot of stuff. I think they even put in a fake quote one time where
really.
There's a fake quote from him where it says, like, if you want to conquer a people, disarm your citizenry or something like that. And people have said, oh, that was like a quote from Mein Kampf. That's a fake quote.
What translation is that in?
Oh, I don't remember. I just know that's a fake quote. I'm really racking my brain here, but I just know there was a fake quote. Whether or not it was in the book, I'm trying to remember. But I know people connect a certain quote to Hitler that he never said. Because what's ironic is Weimar Republic had a really strict, really strict laws on guns, and it was actually when the Nazis came in that he wanted Germans to actually be able to own guns. Which is insane. And so I think they made that quote to try to lie about that. But yeah, if you do look that quote up, it does say it's a false quote. But for a while, people were throwing that one around. And I think they said it was from Mein Kampf, but it's just not true.
Right. Fair enough. We'll go with a couple more questions here and then we'll call it. Let's see. What are your thoughts on Operation Reinhardt?
Operation Reinhardt. What is that? Sorry. I actually don't know that. My bad.
All good.
Sounds familiar.
I think it's some alleged order of mass extermination or what have you.
Oh my gosh. Yes. Is that the one where they talk about the final solution? Where they say that?
I think that's the Wannsee conference, although maybe that was the start of Operation.
Is that what I'm thinking? Is that what I'm thinking of?
Is actually no. There's a funny story with that. That's actually the first.
Hold on.
That's actually one of the first things I looked at in my whole life, like the first ever dip of dissident or revisionist history that I ever got exposed to in my life. In high school, I think it was year 10 or 11. I think it was year 10.
Oh,
where I
okay.
Taught, it was World War II history, and we were taught like, the Nazis wanted to exterminate all the Jews just because. And the Wannsee conference is where they planned that all out. They made the decision for the final solution.
Oh, okay.
And just out of my pure curiosity, I didn't have a concept of what the dissident right was at all. But as I mentioned earlier, I was always just of that historically sober mind where it's just where I don't freak out if people have dissident takes. So I just decided, okay, that's what I've been taught. I'm going to read the Wannsee conference, like the main minutes or whatever. I did that. I did word searches and everything, and I couldn't find anything about an extermination order.
Yeah.
Nothing.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I didn't know what the name. Are you sure you want to touch this? Are you sure you want
to? What do you think could happen?
Because essentially, it's talking about the extermination of them, but there are people who, as you kind of said, severely question that, and then that goes into the question of, okay, well, how true is the narrative of the, that whole situation of were the camps actually extermination camps?
Right.
You understand where I'm kind of going with that?
Yeah, I get it. Obviously, I'm fine with the chat in any time and place, but I'm just thinking of the YouTube.
Yeah, that's why I'm kind of, because I
make it extremely brief and vague.
So yeah, I'm so sorry that I didn't know the name of the operation. That was my bad. But I know for a fact that the word final solution was used apparently by the German High Command when they were talking about this on like what to do with the Jewish people, especially after Kristallnacht, when they actually started to kick them out, like when they specifically targeted Jewish people and started to move them to camps. When that term was used, like that term final solution was pretty sure was used by like the Balfour Declaration, or not the Declaration, the Balfour, there was like the meeting they had like in the late 1800s, because that term essentially is another way of saying the JQ, like what do we do? And that was their discussion, was what's the final solution for us? Do we want to go back to the homeland? Do we want to remain these in kind of internationalist group? Like, what do we want to do? And so from what I've read and from what I've understood is that when the German command was using the term final solution, they were also talking about what do we do with these people, not necessarily wanting to exterminate people. Because that's the thing. They say that Hitler apparently gave a command for that. But kind of as you said, as you were kind of talking about, I don't even think there's really, it even says it on it's so funny. that they even said it on their own Holocaust website, that it says Adolf Hitler and Hermann Goering personally tasked him with drafting plans for the solution of the Jewish question. So even their own website kind of admits that like that term "find a solution" was connected to the Jewish question, not necessarily extermination, because a lot of people don't know, but Hitler actually did meet with Jewish leaders and actually made a deal with them to leave the country as long as they used German goods, but they actually wanted them to leave. There was a decision there for a second before they moved them into the concentration camps in the East. So my personal thoughts on, I guess, that is that just personally, I severely question that stuff.
Sure.
I severely question that, the narrative surrounding a lot of that. I think there's a lot of, like, even including the number they give us, if you understand what I'm saying. I and don't get me wrong, I think they were sent to those.
I want to repeat a certain joke, which you may know what I'm talking about.
I know
so badly.
But I severely question the number they give us on how many died or were, you know what I mean? I severely question that, because
so fair enough. You basically say you're not a Christian anymore. That's fair enough.
And I think the most compelling evidence was for that, and you can look this up, is that at a certain camp, we'll say, I'll just say it, Auschwitz, they had a plaque on there that said 4 million died. And then in 1989, they changed the number to 1 million. And so if the number remained the same, right? So that I'm only going to kind of give that one. But yes, I severely question personally that whole narrative, just personally. Now, this doesn't mean they didn't target them, that they didn't go to these camps, that they didn't die, that there weren't people who were murdered, who weren't shots and things like that. You're right. I do think that. But I severely question the extent of what was going on. Now, there is more evidence that the Soviet Union was 1,000 times worse than anything the Germans were kind of doing. So that's another reason why I severely question it. So I usually keep my focus on the Soviet Union. So because the Germans were actually blamed for, like, the Katier Forest. The Germans were blamed for that, but later come to find out this is in Stalin's war. Come to find out that the Russians had done that massacre.
Wow.
They killed like 30,000 Polish elites.
Sheesh.
Yeah, and they blamed that on the Germans originally, but then they changed it through documentation that has been coming out. So,
wow. Okay, fair enough. And for that, we may call it at that. I think that was honestly a great place to leave it.
Yeah, I was gonna say, it's like I can't believe we're gonna end it on that one.
So this is by far and away my most controversial interview on my entire channel.
Yeah,
single most controversial video period on my channel, and I'm okay with that because nothing we said here, in the end, irrespective of the factual data itself, obviously people can debate that. There's obviously people disagreeing in the comments. That's fine, but in terms of principle, in terms of what we're saying in principle, nothing sinful, nothing non-Christian here, and in fact, things which Christians should defend, at least in the principle of debate. Even if you as a Christian believe everything that is the mainstream story of World War II and good guy versus bad guy, what have you, even if you believe all that just fine, you as a Christian should absolutely join us in condemning other so-called Christians who attack and want to ruin the lives of people who merely entertain dissident ideas on these things. You should be for open debate on these things. That is how, ironically, if you want to stop the ungodly form of actual Jew hate, that's how you stop it, by mainstreaming the discussion and not keeping it as a dissident right thing. That's kind of what we discussed at the very beginning, where because of the neglect of Christian leaders, so many young Christian men are not finding answers to issues like this and others from Christian leaders, but they go into people who are genuinely off the reservation when it comes to Christian standards. And so if we want to stop that, this has to be mainstreamed. This discussion has to be allowed to happen. And of course, there's going to be a struggle to make that happen because there are certain interests out there, and I'll say it straight up, yes, including Jewish activist organizations who don't want that to happen. So there's going to be a struggle with that, but it has to happen if you don't want people going to the genuinely dangerous, certain genuinely dangerous ideological factions. So that's, God willing, what we have achieved with this discussion, helping particularly my normie friends here who may be watching this. I really hope you haven't tuned out. I hope you're able to take this in, digest it, and God willing, if you want to research into Second World War history and related things, that this is a good starting point at minimum for that. So once again, Saint Militant, thank you so much for joining me. Where can people find you?
Yeah, so once again, Saint Militant, and you can find my channel. It's called A Time for War. Once again, essentially what I mostly was talking about was more about evangelicalism, but I've kind of leaned into this because I just felt, it's important. The whole channel is about knowing your enemies, understanding the times you live in, and working through that together, and finding your allies when you can. So definitely join me. I really am only on YouTube. I don't have any like podcasts or anything. I really only work on YouTube. And so that's where you can find me, A Time for War.
Excellent stuff. And people, find his channel linked in the description below. Seriously, give him a sub and give his material a watch, including the initial video show, but also his other videos. He's got genuinely great stuff. He deserves some love. Let's blow up his subscriber count. So once again, thank you so much, Saint Militant, for coming on. And as a final announcement for people, today is the weekly day where I have my gaming streams, but I'm a bit tired from this, and I have a bunch of other work I have to do today. So I'm going to be pushing my Crusader Kings 3 gaming stream to tomorrow. So same time as usual, 10 a.m. Sydney time, but tomorrow. So keep an eye out for that. But apart from that, thank you so much, Saint Militant, for coming on. And thank you, everybody, for watching this very spicy, yet God willing, very edifying and enlightening stream. This has been Saint Militant, and this has been The Other Paul. I hope you all have a lovely day or evening. God bless.